Billionaire CEO took his triplets on a blind date. Pretended to be broke. Everything changed when she... Welcome to Tales by Orion. Let's uncover what really happened. Arthur Vance existed in a world of polished glass and muted acoustics. A kingdom 47 floors above the city's ceaseless hum. His name was etched onto skyscraper lobbies and whispered in boardrooms, a synonym for ruthless efficiency and monolithic success. Yet, in the sterile silence of his penthouse, surrounded by art that was more investment than inspiration, Arthur felt like a ghost haunting the monument of his own life. The silence was his most loyal companion, a vast empty space that wealth could furnish but never fill. It was a silence that had grown profoundly deeper since his wife Eleanor had passed away 3 years prior, leaving him the sole architect of his fortune and the sole guardian of their 3 children, a task for which his business acumen had left him woefully unprepared. The triplets, Leo, Clara, and Finn, were 21, and they were beginning to show the subtle fractures of a life lived in a gilded cage. Leo, the eldest by 7 minutes, wore his privilege like armor, a shield of casual indifference that concealed a gnawing uncertainty about his own worth. Clara, an artist of considerable but unharnessed talent, treated the world with a cynical detachment, her wit a sharpened tool to keep genuine connection at bay. And Finn, the quietest of the 3, had retreated into a digital world of code and algorithms, more comfortable with the logic of machines than the messy unpredictability of human emotion. Arthur saw the reflection of his own emotional absenteeism in them. He had given them everything money could buy, but he had failed to teach them what it could not: the value of a person beyond their net worth, the quiet strength of integrity, the profound currency of empathy. He feared he was raising heirs to his fortune, but not to his humanity. What little of it he felt he had left. The realization was a slow-acting poison, leaving him hollowed out in the quiet hours after the markets closed. The idea arrived not in a flash of brilliance, but as a quiet, desperate thought during another solitary dinner, the clink of his fork against the porcelain plate echoing in the cavernous dining room. He was tired of the women he was set up with, women who saw him as a portfolio, who appraised him with the same calculating eyes as a stockbroker eyeing a rising stock. Their conversations were resumes, their laughter a form of negotiation. He wanted something real, something Eleanor would have recognized as true. More than that, he wanted his children to witness it. He wanted to conduct an experiment, a desperate, unconventional lesson in seeing. He called a meeting, not in his corporate office, but in the rarely used family living room, a space that felt more like a museum exhibit than a home. The triplets slouched on a pristine white sofa, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phones. "I'm going on a blind date," Arthur announced, the words feeling foreign and clumsy. Leo barely looked up. "Don't you have people for that, Dad? A screening committee?" Clara smirked. "Let me guess, the daughter of some European industrialist? Good for the brand." Finn remained silent, his thumb scrolling endlessly. "No," Arthur said, his voice firm, cutting through their practiced apathy. "I've joined a standard dating site, under an assumed name. My profile says I'm a widower named Art, a freelance bookkeeper struggling to make ends meet." 3 heads snapped up in unison. The silence was no longer apathetic, it was electric with disbelief. "You're what?" Clara asked, her cynical mask slipping to reveal genuine shock. "You're going to pretend to be poor?" Leo scoffed, a nervous energy entering his posture. "Why? What is this, some kind of midlife crisis theater? It's insane, it's dishonest." "Is it more dishonest than pretending to be interested in someone's stock options?" Arthur countered, his gaze steady. "I'm not doing this for me, I'm doing this for us." He leaned forward, the polished gleam of the coffee table reflecting his tired, earnest face. "I want you to be there. Not at the table, but nearby. You'll have an earpiece. You will hear every word. I want you to see how a person, a stranger, treats someone they believe has nothing to offer them but their time. I want you to see what character looks like when it isn't being paid for." He had already rented a small, unassuming apartment in a working-class neighborhood across town, a place with worn linoleum floors and a view of a brick wall. This would be their base of operations, his stage for this strange performance. He was stripping away the name Vance, the fortune, the power, to see what, if anything, remained of the man. It was a gamble, not for profit, but for the soul of his family. He had already matched with someone. Her name was Alara. Her profile picture was simple, a candid shot in a community garden, her smile unadorned and genuine. Her bio didn't list achievements, it listed passions. Rainy days, old bookshops, finding the good in people, and my slightly chaotic but big-hearted community center. To the triplets, it sounded impossibly quaint, pathetically naive. To Arthur, it sounded like a lifeline. He was terrified, more terrified than he'd been before any billion-dollar merger. He was about to become Art, the struggling bookkeeper, and he had no idea if the man was worth knowing. The rented apartment smelled of lemon-scented cleaner and old wood, a stark, almost monastic contrast to the ozonic, climate-controlled air of their penthouse. For the triplets, it was like stepping into a historical diorama. They moved awkwardly through the two-bedroom space, their designer sneakers silent on the faded floral-patterned rug. Clara ran a finger over a dusty windowsill, inspecting it with a theatrical grimace. Leo paced the small living room, his long legs covering the distance in 3 strides, a caged tiger in a petting zoo. "I still can't believe we're doing this," he muttered, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "It's degrading." "It's for science, Leo," Clara said, her voice dripping with irony. "The study of a species known as the common folk. Try not to scare them with your watch." Finn, meanwhile, had found the one comfortable spot, a slightly lumpy armchair by the window, and was methodically setting up the audio surveillance equipment. A tiny flesh-toned earpiece for his father. A receiver connected to 3 sets of high-end headphones. For him, the morality of the situation was secondary to the technical challenge. It was a problem with variables, and he was focused on a successful execution. Arthur emerged from the bedroom wearing his costume, a pair of well-worn jeans he hadn't owned in decades, a faded blue button-down shirt, and a simple, practical jacket. The effect was startling. The aura of power that usually surrounded him had vanished, replaced by a quiet vulnerability. He looked like just a man, a tired father trying his best. The sight unsettled his children more than his announcement had. "How do I look?" he asked, his voice lacking its usual command. "Like you need a better-paying job," Clara quipped. But her eyes held a flicker of something else. Unease, perhaps even a sliver of pity. Arthur managed a weak smile. He felt the part. The anxiety of paying bills he didn't have. The weight of a life of constant struggle. He was beginning to inhabit the fiction, and it was heavier than he'd imagined. The plan was set. Arthur, as Art, would meet Alara at a small independent coffee shop. The triplets would be in a booth at the diner across the street, a place with greasy spoons and cracked vinyl seats, watching and listening. Finn had tested the connection. The audio was crystal clear. They would be ghosts at the feast, silent judges in a trial of character. As Arthur prepared to leave, a wave of cold fear washed over him. What if this was a terrible mistake? What if he humiliated himself? What if, stripped of his wealth, he truly had nothing to offer? He looked at his children, at their faces clouded with a mixture of scorn, curiosity, and a buried, almost imperceptible concern. This was why. This was the entire point. He was not just testing Alara, he was testing himself, and in doing so, holding up a mirror to them. "All right," he said, taking a deep breath, "I'm going in." The triplets watched from the diner's large window as their father walked across the street, his stride less confident, his shoulders slightly hunched. He looked smaller, more ordinary than they had ever seen him. He disappeared into the coffee shop, and a moment later, his voice, tinny and distant, crackled to life in their headphones. "I'm here," he said, his breath audible. "I see her." Across the street, Alara was sitting at a small table by the window, reading a paperback book. She wore a simple green sweater, and had her hair tied back in a loose ponytail. She looked up as Art approached, and a warm, unassuming smile lit up her face. In the diner, Clara leaned forward, her cynicism momentarily forgotten, replaced by an intense curiosity. "Okay," she whispered, as if Alara could hear her. "Let's see who you really are." The initial conversation was as awkward as Arthur had feared. He fumbled with his order, unused to paying in cash and counting out change. He talked about the weather. She asked about his work, and he delivered his pre-rehearsed lines about bookkeeping, the ebb and flow of freelance gigs. "And you have 3 children?" she asked, her eyes full of genuine interest. "Triplets. All grown up, finding their way," he said, the words feeling both true and false. "It must have been hard, raising them on your own." Her voice was soft, devoid of pity, full of simple, empathetic understanding. "It had its moments," Arthur replied, a genuine weariness seeping into his tone. "They're good kids though. Just a little lost, I think." He was speaking more honestly than he'd intended. Across the street, Leo shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It felt like an accusation. The conversation flowed, and Arthur found himself relaxing into the role of Art. He wasn't performing anymore, he was simply talking. He asked about her community center, and her entire demeanor changed. Her passion was a palpable force. She spoke of teenagers who everyone else had written off, of creating a safe space where they could discover their talents, of the constant draining struggle for funding. She wasn't complaining, she was sharing her purpose. "We're trying to build a small music studio," she said, her eyes alight. "We have a few donated guitars, an old keyboard, but the soundproofing is a nightmare. For now the whole neighborhood knows when Marcus is practicing his drumming." She laughed, a clear, bright sound. "But he's so proud of his progress. It's worth it." Arthur listened, utterly captivated. He was used to people talking about quarterly growth and market share. Ilara was talking about saving lives with a second-hand drum kit. In the diner, the triplets were silent, the sounds of their father's conversation, and the clatter of cutlery around them, creating a strange, surreal soundscape. Finn had a small, thoughtful frown on his face. Clara was watching Ilara's expressive face, her own cynical expression slowly dissolving. Leo stared out the window, his jaw tight. He heard a woman describe a world of scarcity and struggle, yet she spoke with more joy and purpose than anyone in his own opulent world. For the first time, a crack appeared in his armor of indifference. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't just a test for Ilara, it was a test for them too, and he had a sinking feeling they were already failing. The coffee cup felt warm in Arthur's hands, a small anchor in the unfamiliar sea of this new identity. He found himself talking more freely than he had in years, the persona of art paradoxically allowing a more authentic version of himself to surface. He spoke of his late wife, not as the society hostess the world knew, but as Eleanor, the woman who loved gardening and had a mischievous laugh. He was sharing the man, not the myth, and Ilara listened with an attentiveness that felt like a gift. She didn't offer platitudes or try to fill the silences. She simply allowed the space for his grief to be acknowledged, a courtesy so profound in its simplicity that it almost brought him to tears. The conversation eventually turned to dinner plans. This was the first major deliberate test he had planned. In his world, a first date would involve a reservation at a restaurant where the wine list had its own table of contents. "I was thinking," he began, his voice carefully calibrated to sound hopeful yet hesitant. "There's a little Italian place a few blocks from here. It's nothing fancy, but it's quiet, and the pasta is, well, it's good." He was in fact referring to a place he'd had his driver scout, a humble family-run trattoria with checkered tablecloths and Chianti bottles for candle holders. It was the antithesis of his life. Across the street, the triplets tensed. This was a critical juncture. "Nothing fancy sounds perfect," Ilara said immediately, her smile not wavering for an instant. "I'm not a fancy person, Art. I'm more of a good food and good company kind of person. Lead the way." In the diner, a collective inaudible sigh of relief passed between the siblings. Leo looked at Clara, a silent question in his eyes. She just shook her head slightly, as if to say, "So far, so good." As they walked, the city seemed different to Arthur. He noticed the small details he usually sped past in the back of his town car. A mural painted on a brick wall, the sound of a saxophone player on a street corner, the smell of roasted nuts from a street vendor. Ilara pointed things out, sharing her city with him. A city he technically owned pieces of but had never truly inhabited. She was the tour guide to a world that had been invisible to him. The trattoria was cozy and loud, filled with the boisterous chatter of families and couples. The owner, a stout man named Sal, greeted them with a booming ciao, and led them to a small, slightly wobbly table in the corner. For a moment, Arthur felt a pang of his old self. He had an urge to discreetly slip Sal a $100 bill to ensure perfect service, to control the environment. He resisted. He was Art, and Art could only offer a polite smile. They ordered simple dishes, spaghetti bolognese for him, ravioli for her. The conversation flowed as easily as the cheap house read. She told him funny stories about the kids at the center, like the time they tried to fix the toaster and accidentally fused it to the countertop. He found himself laughing, a real, unburdened laugh that felt rusty from disuse. And then came the first real obstacle, an unforeseen variable in his carefully controlled experiment. A young couple was seated at the table next to them. The man was loud, ostentatious, and vaguely familiar. "So I told my dad, a G-Wagon is practically a necessity in this city," the young man boasted to his date, who looked thoroughly unimpressed. "It's about presents, you know?" Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. The young man was Preston Hayes, the son of a business rival, and Preston had met the triplets at several charity galas. In the diner, Leo's face went pale. "Oh no," he whispered into his headset's mic, a feature Finn had enabled for emergencies. "Dad, that's Preston Hayes. If he sees you." But it was too late. Preston's eyes scanned the room with an air of bored ownership, and then landed on Arthur. A flicker of confused recognition crossed his face. He squinted, his brain trying to reconcile the face of the titan of industry, Arthur Vance, with the man in the cheap shirt sitting at a wobbly table. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. The entire charade was about to collapse in the most humiliating way possible. Before he could react, Preston's gaze shifted past him, and he broke into a broad, condescending smile. Well, look what we have here, he said, his voice carrying across the small space. Clara? Leo? Is that you? Arthur froze. He hadn't seen them come in, but following Preston's gaze, he saw his son and daughter standing near the entrance, dressed down in jeans and sweaters from their costume pile back at the apartment. Clara, thinking on her feet with astonishing speed, had seen Preston enter the restaurant from the diner window. Realizing the danger, she and Leo had sprinted across the street, leaving a bewildered Finn with the audio equipment. Clara smiled a tight, practiced smile at Preston. Preston, fancy seeing you here. Here, Preston said, his eyes sweeping the humble restaurant with disdain. I thought you Vances only ate at places with Michelin stars. Don't tell me you're doing some kind of poverty tourism. Leo stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Clara's arm. His voice was steady, calm, a perfect imitation of a struggling student. Actually, we're here to meet our dad for dinner, he said, nodding towards Arthur. We were just grabbing a table. He then looked at Arthur, and for the first time, Arthur saw not a privileged heir, but a son protecting his father. Hey Dad, Leo said, the word dad filled with a newfound protective warmth. Sorry we're late. Class ran over. Alara looked between Arthur and his suddenly appeared children, her expression one of gentle surprise. Arthur, recovering, managed a nod. Leo, Clara, this is Alara. Alara, these are two of my children. Clara extended a hand to Alara, her smile now genuine. It's so nice to finally meet you. Dad's told us, well, he hasn't stopped talking about you, actually. The lie was so smooth, so kind, it took Arthur's breath away. He watched his children, who had once scoffed at this entire idea, now active participants, defenders of the fiction. They were playing their parts not to mock him, but to shield him, and in doing so, to shield Alara from the ugly condescension of Preston Hayes. They were learning the lesson in real time, not as observers, but as actors in a play about human dignity. Preston, snubbed and confused, turned back to his date with a huff. The crisis was averted. Leo and Clara squeezed into the small booth, creating a chaotic but strangely comfortable crowd. The dynamic of the date had shifted entirely. It was no longer a one-on-one meeting, it was a family dinner. And Arthur Vance, for the first time in a very long time, felt genuinely, unequivocally, like a father. The addition of Leo and Clara to the small table transformed the evening. What had been a delicate, probing conversation between two strangers became a lively, chaotic, and unexpectedly warm family affair. Alara, far from being intimidated, seemed to bloom in their presence. She had a natural gift for drawing people out, asking Leo about his supposed classes, and listening with genuine interest as he stumbled through a vague description of a business ethics course, a topic that until that moment, he had only ever considered in terms of avoiding lawsuits. Clara, to Arthur's astonishment, began talking about her art, not in the glib, dismissive way she usually did, but with a hesitant sincerity. She described a project she was theoretically working on, about capturing the unnoticed beauty in urban decay, like finding the soul in forgotten things, Alara offered, her eyes lighting up with understanding. That's beautiful. Clara fell silent, looking down at her hands. No one had ever called her ideas beautiful, they called them provocative, or a good investment. The simple, heartfelt validation from this woman, who thought she was a struggling artist's contemporary, rather than a wealthy patron, visibly disarmed her. Arthur watched the exchange, a profound sense of wonder washing over him. He was seeing his children through Alara's eyes, and in her gaze, they were not jaded heirs, but thoughtful, creative young people. Perhaps this was who they were all along, buried beneath layers of wealth and expectation. The lie was becoming a strange kind of truth. They were a family, sitting in a cheap restaurant, sharing a meal, and a real connection. Across the street, Finn was a lone sentinel in the diner. He listened to the overlapping voices, the clinking of forks, the warm laughter. He could hear his siblings, not just their words, but the change in their tone. The sarcasm was gone, replaced by a tentative earnestness. He heard his father's voice, relaxed and happy. He wasn't just monitoring a data stream anymore. He was witnessing a metamorphosis. He pulled out his phone and texted a single message to the encrypted group chat he shared with his siblings. She's good for him. For us. It was the highest praise Finn was capable of giving. The meal concluded, and the bill arrived. It was a laughably small amount to Arthur, but a significant sum for Art. He pulled a worn leather wallet from his pocket, another prop, and carefully counted out the cash, leaving a modest but respectable tip. He saw Alara watch him, her expression unreadable. He braced himself for a sign of judgment, a subtle flicker of disappointment that he couldn't be more extravagant. Instead, she simply smiled. "That was a lovely meal," she said. "Thank you, Art." The sincerity in her voice was a physical blow, dismantling another brick in the fortress around his heart. As they stood to leave, Leo and Clara made their excuses, saying they had to get back to studying, a claim that was so out of character it was almost comical. They said their goodbyes to Alara, both of them shaking her hand with a warmth that was entirely genuine. "It was really, really nice meeting you," Leo said, and he meant it. "I hope we see you again." The walk back towards the coffee shop where they'd met was quiet and contemplative. The city lights seemed softer, the night air less cold. Arthur felt a deep reluctance for the evening to end, to step out of the comfortable skin of Art and back into the gilded prison of Arthur Vance. He knew the next test was the most difficult, the one that felt the cruelest. "I'm sorry," he said, stopping on the sidewalk. "I know this is presumptuous, but I didn't budget for a taxi back for you. I was hoping, is the bus okay?" He felt like the lowest form of life, deliberately manufacturing a moment of hardship. He was testing her patience, her classism, her very spirit. He hated himself for it, but he had to see it through. He had to know. Alara looked at him, and for a long moment, she just studied his face in the glow of the streetlights. He could see the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the manufactured worry he wore like a second skin. Her expression softened into something that looked like pure, unadulterated kindness. "Art," she said, her voice gentle. "I have a bus pass, and I prefer it, actually. You get to see more of the city." She then did something that completely undid him. She reached out and briefly touched his arm. "Don't worry about things like that. It's not what makes an evening good or bad. It was a wonderful night because I spent it with a kind man and his wonderful children. That's all that matters." In his ear, Arthur heard a sharp intake of breath. It must have been Finn. He could picture his sons and daughter, scattered and separate, but united in hearing this simple, profound declaration of his worth, a worth completely detached from his wealth. It was the thesis statement for his entire desperate experiment, delivered with a gentle touch on a city sidewalk. The deception felt heavy and sour in his gut, but the truth of her character shone so brightly it almost eclipsed the lie. As they walked towards the bus stop, they passed a small, dimly lit storefront. It was her community center. "Oh, here it is," she said, her voice full of pride. "It's not much to look at when it's closed, but it's home to a lot of kids." Arthur stopped, peering through the large window. He could see the worn-out sofas, the walls covered in vibrant, chaotic art, the corner she'd described as the studio with its mismatched instruments. It was a place of scarcity, held together by sheer force of will. His will could move markets and build empires. Her will could build a sanctuary on a shoestring budget. He knew, in that moment, which was the greater power. "You've built something incredible here, Alara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. "No," she replied, turning to him, her eyes reflecting the streetlights. "We've built it, together. It takes a village, you know." He was a man who owned half the city, yet he had never felt a part of any village. Standing there pretending to be a man with nothing, he felt the first stirrings of what it might be like to truly belong. The bus ride was a revelation. Arthur hadn't been on public transport in over 30 years. He sat beside Alara on the hard plastic seat, the carriage rattling and swaying, carrying a cross-section of the city's lifeblood, a tired nurse in scrubs, a student with headphones, a mother trying to soothe a fussy baby. It was a world of quiet, shared existence he had completely insulated himself from. He wasn't an observer from a tinted window anymore. He was a part of the tapestry, just another man heading home after a long day. Alara seemed perfectly at ease, pointing out landmarks and sharing small anecdotes about the neighborhoods they passed through. She spoke of the city, not as a collection of assets and properties, but as a living organism with its own stories, its own heartbreaks and triumphs. For her, every street corner had a history, every park bench held a memory. She was showing him the city he lived in but had never seen. When they arrived at her stop, he walked her to the door of her modest apartment building. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the unspoken resonance of the evening. Under the dim glow of the porch light, he felt the immense weight of his deception. This good, kind, genuine woman had opened her heart to a fiction. The guilt was a sharp, physical pain. He had to end this, but how? How could he reveal the truth without shattering the fragile, beautiful thing that had grown between them? "I had a really wonderful time tonight, Art," she said, breaking the silence. Her smile was a little tired, but completely genuine. "I haven't had a night like this in a long time." "Me neither," he said, the words catching in his throat. It was the truest thing he had said all night. "You know," she continued, looking at him with a startlingly perceptive gaze, "for someone who claims to be a bookkeeper, you have the eyes of a man who carries the world on his shoulders. I hope you let someone help you with that burden sometimes." Her insight was a dagger to his heart. She saw him. Even through the disguise, through the lies, she saw the weight he carried. She didn't see a billionaire CEO. She saw a burdened soul. And she wasn't repelled by it. She was concerned. He wanted to confess everything right then and there, to tear off the mask of Art and beg for her forgiveness. But the words wouldn't come. The fear of her reaction, of her seeing him not as a liar, but as a manipulator, a cruel puppeteer playing games with her emotions, was too great. He simply nodded, unable to speak. "Good night, Art," she said softly, before turning and disappearing into the building. He stood on the sidewalk for a long time, the name Art echoing in his mind. It was the name she knew him by, the name of the man she had deemed worthy of her time and her kindness. He felt a profound sense of loss, as if he were already mourning the end of a relationship that had never truly begun. The town car that picked him up a block away felt alien, a cold, sterile pod that ripped him from the real world he had just inhabited. His driver, a man who had been with him for 15 years, did a double take at his changed appearance and the raw emotion on his face, but said nothing. Arthur didn't go back to the penthouse. He went to the small, rented apartment where his children were waiting. They were all there, even Finn, who had packed up his gear and joined his siblings. The television was off. They were just sitting in the small living room, waiting. The air was thick with unspoken thoughts. "So?" Clara asked, her voice quiet, stripped of its usual irony. Arthur sank into the lumpy armchair, the one Finn had occupied earlier. He felt utterly drained, emotionally exhausted in a way he hadn't been after the most grueling of corporate battles. He started, but he couldn't find the word. "She's real," Leo finished for him, his voice full of a quiet awe. "Everything about her. Her insight about you carrying the world on your shoulders," Finn said, looking at his father with new eyes. "She saw past the costume. She saw you." They spent the next hour dissecting the evening, not as a successful experiment, but as a life-altering experience. They spoke of Alara's kindness, her passion, her complete lack of judgment. They talked about how they had felt, playing their parts, defending their struggling father from Preston's scorn. They had been forced to stand on the other side of the social chasm, and the view had changed them. The contempt they had initially felt for the experiment had been replaced by a deep, humbling respect for what it had revealed. "You can't keep lying to her, Dad," Clara said, her voice firm with a newfound moral clarity. "It's not fair. She deserves the truth." "But how?" Arthur asked, looking at his children, his co-conspirators. "How do I tell her that our entire evening, our entire connection, was based on a lie? She'll hate me, and she'll be right to." "Maybe not," Finn said thoughtfully. "The premise was a lie, but your reactions weren't. What you felt, what we all felt, that was real. The lie created a space for a deeper truth to emerge." It was a stunningly mature and insightful observation from his quietest son. Arthur looked at them, truly looked at them, and saw the change he had so desperately hoped for. They weren't the same people who had slouched on the penthouse sofa less than 24 hours ago. The experiment, regardless of its outcome with Alara, had already succeeded in its primary mission. It had woken them up. It had reconnected them to their own humanity. Now they had to face the consequences together. The question was no longer about winning or losing. It was about honoring the woman who had in one single evening taught them all a lesson in value that a lifetime of wealth never could. The next morning, the rented apartment felt like a war room. The mission, Operation Truth. The mood was somber but resolute. The easy camaraderie of the previous night had been replaced by a shared sense of responsibility. They weren't just fixing their father's problem. They were trying to right a collective wrong. "A text message is out," Clara declared, pacing the small room. "It's cowardly. An email is just a longer, more formal version of a text. A phone call is better, but she can hang up," Leo added, leaning against the kitchen counter. You need to do this face to face. She deserves that. Arthur agreed, but the logistics were a nightmare. Do I show up at her door as Art and then a limousine pulls up behind me? Do I invite her to the penthouse? Every scenario feels like a cruel punchline to a joke she was never in on. It was Finn, the logician, who saw the solution. The setting is the key, he said, looking up from his laptop. The lie began because of who you are, but the connection happened because of who she is. The reveal should honor her, not you. It shouldn't happen in your world or in the fake world. It has to happen in hers. He paused, letting the idea land. Her community center. That's her truth. That's the place you need to be. A plan began to form, one that was complex, risky, and ridiculously extravagant, but its core was sincere. It wouldn't just be about a confession, it would be about an apology delivered not just in words but in action. For the rest of the day, Arthur Vance did what he did best. He mobilized resources, but this time it wasn't for a corporate takeover, it was for an act of profound contrition. He made a series of quiet, powerful calls. He didn't use his own name, but the name of a philanthropic foundation he anonymously controlled. First, he called the landlord of the building that housed Alara's center. By noon, the foundation owned the entire building. The threat of rent increases or eviction, a constant source of stress she had mentioned, was gone forever. Next, he contacted a major music supply company. He didn't ask for donations. He placed an order. The best soundproofing materials. A brand new drum kit for Marcus. Microphones, mixing boards, guitars, keyboards, everything she had dreamed of for her studio. Then came the call to a construction firm, an interior designer who specialized in community spaces, and an educational software company. The instructions were clear: work fast, work quiet, and be ready by tomorrow morning. While Arthur coordinated the logistics, the triplets had their own mission. They went shopping, not on Fifth Avenue, but at art supply stores, hardware stores, and sporting goods shops. They filled carts with canvases, paints, sketch pads, basketballs, soccer nets, and books. They weren't just buying things, they were fulfilling the needs Alara had unknowingly described to them. Each item was a tangible piece of their own apology. That evening, as a small, discreet army of professionals descended on the community center to work through the night, Arthur sat down to write a letter. He couldn't trust himself to say everything perfectly, and he needed her to have something to read and process in her own time. He wrote not as the CEO, but as the man from the night before. He wrote of his loneliness, his fear for his children, the gilded cage he had built for himself. He explained the desperate, misguided logic of his experiment. He didn't make excuses. He laid his soul bare on the page, confessing his admiration for her character, her strength, and her heart. He confessed that in pretending to be a better man, she had inspired him to actually become one. The next morning, Alara received a simple text message. It was from Art. Could you meet me at the center in an hour? There's something I need to show you. Something I need to tell you. She agreed, a knot of curiosity and slight apprehension tightening in her stomach. When she arrived, the first thing she noticed was the silence. The usual city noise seemed to fade away. The front door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The change was so immense, so total, that for a moment she thought she was in the wrong building. The worn-out sofas had been replaced with comfortable, durable new ones. The walls were freshly painted in a warm, inviting yellow. The floors gleamed. In the corner where the old toaster had once been, there was a brand new, fully equipped kitchenette. Her eyes darted around, taking in the shelves stacked with new books, the bins filled with art supplies, the crisp newness of everything. She walked in a daze towards the back room, the one she called the studio. She pushed the door open. It swung silently on new hinges. The room was unrecognizable. It was a professional-grade music studio, fully soundproofed, with a gleaming drum kit sitting on a small riser, guitars hanging on the walls, and a mixing board that looked like the cockpit of a spaceship. Tears welled in her eyes, a mixture of overwhelming joy and profound confusion. "What is this?" she whispered to the empty room. "This is an apology." The voice came from the main room. She turned. Standing there, in the middle of the transformed space, was Art. But it wasn't Art. He was wearing an impeccably tailored suit, his posture straight, his face etched with a familiar anxiety. But the tired, defeated air was gone. He looked powerful, confident, and deeply, deeply sad. Beside him stood his 3 children, their faces a mirror of his own, pained expression. Arthur Vance held out the letter he had written. My real name is Arthur Vance, he said, his voice quiet but clear. Everything I told you about my life was a lie, but everything I felt, and everything I learned from you, was the absolute truth. Please, he said, his voice breaking slightly, please read this. Alara stood frozen in the middle of her miraculously transformed community center, the letter heavy in her hand. The man before her was a stranger in a familiar shell. The kind, struggling bookkeeper named Art had evaporated, leaving behind this titan of industry, Arthur Vance, a name she recognized from the city's business pages. The whiplash of the revelation was dizzying. She felt a surge of emotions, shock, confusion, a deep, biting sense of betrayal. She had been the subject of a game, a sociological experiment played by a man so wealthy, he could treat real life like a laboratory. Her mind replayed their evening, every shared confidence, every moment of connection, and tainted it with the bitter taste of deception. His talk of financial struggles, his worry over the dinner bill, the bus ride. It was all a meticulously crafted performance. She felt like a fool. Her gaze flickered to Leo, Clara, and Finn, who stood beside their father, unable to meet her eyes. They were not struggling students. They were heirs to an empire, complicit in the charade. The kindness she had seen in them, the protective instincts, had that been a lie too? Why? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, the single word carrying the full weight of her hurt. Arthur didn't try to defend himself. He simply gestured to the letter. It's all in there. My reasons, not my excuses. He looked at her, his eyes pleading. I know I have no right to ask for anything, but I hope you'll believe that the man you had dinner with, the one who was captivated by your passion and your goodness, was more real than the man who stands before you now. With that, he and his children turned and walked out, leaving her alone in the silent, newly perfect space. She sank onto one of the new sofas, the crisp fabric feeling foreign and cold. For a long time she just sat there, the letter unopened on her lap. Part of her wanted to tear it up, to throw it away along with the memory of the entire humiliating episode. Part of her wanted to rage at the injustice, at the sheer arrogance of it. But then she looked around. She saw the state-of-the-art drum kit, and thought of Marcus, whose face would split into a grin so wide it would hurt. She saw the shelves of new books and pictured the quiet girl, Sophia, who used the center as a library because her home was too chaotic. She saw the soundproofed walls and imagined the joy of making music without limits. This wasn't just an apology. It was a dream made real. It was a profound, life-altering gift to the children she had dedicated her life to. The gesture was as monumental as the lie. With trembling hands, she opened the letter. She read of his crushing loneliness, of a world so insulated by wealth that it had become a prison. She read of his fears for his children, of his desperate desire to teach them a lesson he felt he was failing to embody. He wrote about her profile, about how it had stood out like a beacon of authenticity in a sea of artifice. He described their evening from his perspective, the terror, the surprise, the dawning, humbling respect. He wrote that her simple statement about him having a kind heart being richer than any bank account had shattered his entire worldview. He wasn't asking for forgiveness, he was thanking her. He was thanking her for reminding him what true value was. The anger in her heart began to recede, replaced by a complex, aching empathy. He had lied. Yes, the method was wrong, deceptive, and deeply hurtful. But the motive was born of a pain she could understand. It was the pain of disconnection, of a man lost in a world of his own making, trying to find his way back to something real. By the time she finished the letter, tears were streaming down her face. They were not tears of anger anymore, but of a profound, complicated sorrow, and a strange, burgeoning hope. The community center was not a bribe. It was penance. It was the only way a man like Arthur Vance knew how to say, "You changed me." A week passed. Arthur heard nothing. He and the triplets existed in a state of limbo, back in the penthouse that now felt more like a mausoleum than ever. The experiment had succeeded in breaking them open, but it felt like a hollow victory. The connection that had sparked the change was gone, likely forever. The triplets were different now. They were quieter, more thoughtful. Leo had started volunteering at a soup kitchen, wanting to understand the world beyond his bubble. Clara had cleared out a studio space in the penthouse, and was painting with a feverish intensity, her canvases filled not with abstract cynicism, but with portraits of the people she'd seen on the street. Finn was designing a free coding boot camp for underprivileged kids. Alara's influence had been a catalyst, setting off a chain reaction of purpose in their lives. One afternoon, Arthur was staring out his office window when his assistant buzzed him. "Sir, "There's a Miss Alara to see you. She doesn't have an appointment." Arthur's heart stopped. "Send her in," he managed to say. Alara walked into the vast, intimidating office. She was dressed simply, in her usual jeans and a sweater. She looked small against the backdrop of his corporate power, but her presence was anything but. She looked at him, her gaze clear and steady. "I have a few conditions," she said, her voice firm. There was no preamble, no accusation. "First, this," she said, gesturing around the office. "The foundation, the money. It's a tool. It can never be a substitute for human connection. I want your family, not just your funds. I want your children on my board. I want their hands, not just their checkbook." "Done," Arthur said, without hesitation. "Second," she continued, "no more lies. From now on, we are who we are. All of it, the good, the bad, the complicated." "Yes," he said, his voice thick. "Of course." She took a step closer. "And third, Arthur, I would like to have dinner with you, as you, and I'm buying." A slow smile spread across Arthur's face. The first genuine smile in what felt like a lifetime. It was a smile of relief, of hope, of a second chance he never thought he would get. He was not Art, the struggling bookkeeper, nor was he Arthur Vance, the billionaire CEO. In her eyes, he was just a man, flawed and complicated, who was trying to find his way, and that was more than enough. The real story wasn't about a billionaire pretending to be broke. It was about a man so lost in his wealth that he had to pretend to have nothing to finally find something worth everything. Their first real date was at the same Italian trattoria, at the same wobbly table. This time, there were no secrets, no earpieces, no lies. It was just two people, sharing a meal, starting a new chapter, built not on a perfect fantasy, but on a messy, complicated, and beautiful truth. And this time, it was a beginning, not an end. The ripple effect of that one deceptive date spread far beyond their table. The community center flourished, becoming a model for others across the city. The Vance Foundation was reborn, its mission shifting from legacy building to genuine, hands-on community engagement. And the Triplets, no longer heirs in waiting, became architects of their own purpose, their lives forever shaped by the night their father pretended to be poor, to show them what it meant to be rich in spirit. What begins as a search for something true in others, often ends with a discovery of the truth within ourselves. We may think we are testing the world, but more often than not, the world is testing us, holding up a mirror to our own character. It asks us a simple question. What is our real worth when stripped of all our titles, all our possessions, all our masks? The answer lies not in what we have, but in what we give, not in who we pretend to be, but in who we choose to become, especially when we think no one of value is watching.